It's my honor now to introduce our afternoon plenary and fireside chat. No fire, but let's use our imaginations. Featuring futurist Trista Harris and Peter Larn, President and CEO of the Conrad Hilton Foundation. Please come up.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Trista Harris. Peter's going to be joining me in just a little bit. I am a philanthropic futurist and president of Future Good. I'm based in freezing cold Minnesota, so very, very happy to be here with you today. First, I'll start with why I'm a philanthropic futurist. So I bet for many of you, you haven't ever met a philanthropic futurist before, unless you met John Kobara, who is your local philanthropic futurist. He's featured in the book that I'm going to talk about in a little bit. So I've been in the nonprofit sector since I was 13 years old, and I've been in philanthropy for the last 15 years. And about 11 years ago, I got a job running a community foundation, a sister fund of the Liberty Hill Foundation. And I had a little Post-it note on my desk that said, "Learn how endowments work," because I was responsible for our endowment and I had no idea how it worked. And later on that month, the stock market crashed. And our endowment lost between 30 and 50% of its value during that time. And so my new question was, what do we do when we have no money to give away to organizations that are doing some of the most critical work at this time? So that led me on a search to try to figure out what was coming next. So I met with my very large foundation peers and said, did you know this was coming? And is it going to continue to drop? And what do we do when we're foundations that have no money? And nobody else knew either. And so it was a really, really frustrating time to be in philanthropy, where our communities needed so much from us, and we were unable to have the funding that we needed to give away. And we were also really unclear what was happening next. So in that journey of trying to get clarity, I found futurism as a tool. Futurism is traditionally used by businesses to figure out what color shoes you're going to buy next year, and by the government to figure out who's going to hate us next. So it's the sort of tool that hasn't been used by people in our sector that are doing the most critical work, but are often looking backwards as we're doing that work. So we are looking at a 6-month-old grant application. We're looking at 5 to 10-year-old census data to try to figure out what are we going to do next year. And so my work is helping foundations turn that ship around and understand what are the trends that are coming near us so that we can intercept with those trends as we move forward. So after the Headwaters Foundation realigned our work around future trends, we were able to help our grantees align in new ways. We were able to encourage more foundations to invest in the economic justice work that we were doing that was so critical. We had our largest batch of legislative wins that we had in our history, including marriage equity in the state of Minnesota and the first ever homeowners bill of rights to deal with the mortgage foreclosure crisis. So by adjusting our vision as a foundation, we were able to punch way above our weight as we were doing that work. So that opportunity really lit a spark in me to understand what was coming next and then help other people in the sector use those tools as well. So normally what I do is I come to town and I'm the expert that tells you here's the trends that are coming towards you, and I'll be vulnerable with you. That is for sure not enough. It can't be Trista flying all over the place talking to people about what's happening in local communities. What is really needed is for each of you to become experts on the communities and the causes that you care about, and to understand what are the trends that are influencing the things that you care about. So over the last 10 years, I've been on my own journey to understand what's coming next in the future. I've interviewed dozens and dozens of people in fields like human genome mapping, disaster first response, virtual reality, asteroid mining, space tourism. I didn't know most of these things existed. I've also studied strategic foresight at Oxford University and spent a lot of time with the folks at the Institute for the Future that are here today. I even stalked and ended up on the island of a billionaire that I think has a unique view of what's next for the future of philanthropy. I did all this because I want the future to be a lot clearer for you than it was for me when the market dropped. So from all of these conversations, I've developed a model to help the future be much more accessible for you in your work. You'll often hear from futurists that the future is too complicated for you to figure out by yourself. There are too many conflicting trends, change is happening too quickly. Spoiler alert, they tell you that because they make a ton of money consulting with your organizations. The future actually is a lot more visible than I think we give it credit for. So the tools that I'm sharing with you today are in my book, Future Good. For those of you that come to my breakout session, you'll each get a copy. Not that we're a little bit competitive in the breakout sessions. I'm just saying there's books available if you come to mine. So I'll give you a little bit of background. So for the baby boomers in the audience, you may remember the 1960s as a time where we were really excited about the future as a country. We had the space program, modernist design. We even had the cartoon The Jetsons. I thought by now I'd have a Rosie the robot that was like cleaning my house and cooking my food. Instead, I have a Roomba that like bounces all over the place and misses big spots. So the future isn't always as fast as we'd hope for it to be. But since then, our view of the future has gotten a lot more negative. So we have movies like The Matrix and Hunger Games, and even the cartoon WALL-E had a very negative view of the future. We had completely destroyed the planet with garbage. We've started to treat the future like it is this terrible thing that's coming towards us, as opposed to something that we create with the decisions that we make every single day. We've also started to believe that we can't possibly understand what the future holds for us. And I think that's complete nonsense. I think the future is very, very visible if you notice the signs that are giving us a hint of what's coming next. So I have 3 simple steps that if you practice them consistently, it will help you both predict and shape the future of the communities that you care about and the causes that you care about. The first step is stop. This is stop loving the problem. How many of you have spent most of your career in philanthropy in meetings where everybody is loving and talking about the problem? Raise your hand. I feel like that has been most of my time in the field. So what we do is we host meetings where we talk about disparities or how our school systems are broken or how our healthcare systems aren't working. And we spend a lot of time describing in every way possible the ways that these systems are broken. It is for sure important to understand the scope and the scale of the problems that we are working against. But it's really a waste of energy to spend all of your time and energy talking about what doesn't work. So I think that we need to change our mindset in the social sector, especially as foundations, and instead of asking our grantees to describe how terrible things are, instead ask our grantees, what would this problem look like if you were able to completely solve it? What would be different for kids in our communities? What would be different for our elders? What would it feel like as you were walking through the community if we solved all of these issues? And I think for many of us, we don't spend nearly enough time thinking about what success looks like. And as a result of that, we don't have agreement on how to get to success, and we don't have a strategy and process to get there. So there's often a saying where people say, if we can get a man to the moon, how come we haven't been able to solve the poverty crisis? Well, getting to the moon, we were really clear what success looked like. We know where it is. We got people there. We didn't get people there. When it comes to ending poverty, what's the number for poverty? Is it $12,000 a year? Is it for everybody? Is it just for families? Those sort of questions mean that we're not clear about what success looks like. And so as a sector, I think we should spend a lot more time getting clearer about success. The next step is look. And I think that it's important for us to pay attention to the signals of the future that exist in our current reality. We can't just be flexible when change comes. Change is happening way more quickly than it has in the past. That pace of change is only going to get quicker and quicker. And so if you're waiting to be reactive to changes, you're never going to be able to catch up with that pace of change. So one way to understand signals of the future is to make sure that you're spending time paying attention to those trends. There's a saying, the future's already here, it's just not evenly distributed. So there are a lot of examples of what the future is going to look like for all of us, but it's bright spots that exist. Often they say California is the United States, but 20 years into the future. So in many ways, you are living in that future environment for the rest of the country. So some ways to pay attention in this look step are to spend 5% of your time on R&D. We do not spend hardly any time in the social sector, foundations, and nonprofits on research and development. If I talk to a Fortune 500 company and I said, hey, you shouldn't invest any of your time and energy in what's coming next for the products that you're selling, they would think that something was wrong with me. But in the philanthropic sector, we don't set aside time to pay attention to what's coming next, and we for sure don't give our grantees the resources to do the same thing. And so I encourage all of you to start to carve out 5% of your time to pay attention to what's coming towards you for the issues that you care about. So one way to do that is to pay attention to innovations that are happening in your field. Who are the organizations that are really ahead of where your own organization is? What are the sort of things that they're writing about? What are they learning in that process? How could that influence your organization's work? And then what are the innovations outside of your field? So we spend a lot of time together in philanthropy, but often an innovation someplace else can give you a new way of thinking about a long-term problem. So one way that I do this when I'm facing a problem is I pick a random TED Talk. And I see if there's something in that talk that will help me get to the bottom of my problem. So in my last role, I ran the Minnesota Council on Foundations, which is the sister organization to Southern California Grantmakers. And one of our challenges was engaging our membership in our meetings. So how do we make sure that people are getting what they need out of that process? And so as I was wrestling with that issue, I picked a random TED Talk, and the TED Talk was The Power of Introverts. And I realized that the way that we had structured our programs, introverts didn't benefit as much. You got the real benefit if you were willing to raise your hand in front of your peers and ask the question in front of the 600 other folks that are here. And instead we started to build tools where people could interact and share resources and questions and tools with each other. We created something called the Hub, which we used as sort of Facebook for philanthropy, where after our programs, people could list resources and other things that help move the conversation forward. So the look step is really about time, making time for the future in your present. Now, because my corner of the world is philanthropy, I'm going to share a model that I've developed in conjunction with the Institute for the Future about the future of philanthropy. So what you'll see in this top left-hand corner is the way that philanthropy has been now is very similar to the way that it's been for the last 100 years. So the way that Andrew Carnegie did philanthropy is very similar to what it looks like inside of our organizations, where there's top-down governance, so a board of directors making decisions about grant making, very deliberate and clear processes, so the letter of inquiry happens and then the application, and here are all the steps that come. Often a small scale, supporting one organization at a time to create change. Explicit metrics, all of us have gotten amazing at logic models. If you invest X, Y will happen. Incremental impact. So as I've spoken across the country to foundations, a lot of frustration about the slow pace of change that our institutions have been able to make. And often those problems are getting worse faster than the positive impact that we're having. And then tempered speed, which is a very nice way to say that foundations are very slow to make decisions and get money out into the community. So at the same time, we have signals of what the future is going to look like. We have the Zuckerberg participatory governance, where people that are impacted by problems are helping to make decisions. Community foundations have used that model for a number of years, but now I'm starting to see corporate foundations and independent foundations and family foundations that are trying to figure out where is the voice of people that are impacted and how are they helping us make decisions about grants. People closest to problems are closest to solutions as well, so how are we getting them around those tables? The Zuckerberg's gift to an LLC, I think, is an important signal of the changing structure of philanthropy, that 501c3s will not be the only structure moving forward. And then the growth of giving directly and crowdfunding, I think, is a sign of what's coming next for the field. So what's coming next is evolving flexible processes. When I started in philanthropy, we used different color file folders to understand what grant round we are on. We have much better systems now. And so we have the ability to, at the same time, have a grant round for our long-term grantees that we've been supporting for a number of years, a different grant round for emerging issues, a different grant round for disaster philanthropy. We have the structures and process to be able to manage multiple things at once. We will move to the place where the scale is multiple. There's a huge growth of collective impact tables where many organizations are coming together to solve problems. There is not one foundation in this room or in this country that is big enough to create measurable change on the issues that you care about alone. It is only when we work together that we're able to have that transformative impact. There'll be an expectation for immediate speed. If there's a community need, community wants to know where philanthropy is right away, not 6 months later, not a year later. There'll be an expectation that we are there and a useful resource as soon as the community needs us. Transformative impact, so how do we solve problems as opposed to make them 5% less terrible? I feel like across the board, our goals are often how do we make things just not as terrible at the moment? How do we actually start to solve problems? And then how do we move to implied flexible metrics? So I started my career in research. I love a good logic model, but I think there's something really powerful when you give a grantee the ability to come back to you after the grant is complete and say, here's what we've learned and here's our outcomes, as opposed to in the beginning of the process saying, there'll be 3 community meetings, we'll focus on these 2 issues, here will be our 5 partners. When you give the resources and the flexibility for outcomes, organizations are able to be flexible enough to create wonderful outcomes that wouldn't be possible within the smaller constraints that we often give them as a foundation. So I think for many models, what happens is you say, here is the old and here is the new. Philanthropy has existed since the beginning of humankind because it's a wonderful thing. And that isn't going to change. And I think within many of our institutions, we have to decide as we move to the second curve of philanthropy, what do we keep? What works? What within our institutions is so important that we have to hold on to that in that transition? And so for many institutions, it's things like donor intent, skilled staff, deep relationships, and community. Those are things that we need to bring with us in the future. The challenge right now is that these 2 curves are intersecting. So I said the last curve took 100 years. This second curve of philanthropy is about a 10-year curve. We're about 5 or 6 years into this curve already. And the pressure that we're feeling within our institutions is that we have first curve systems and we want second curve impacts. So we see organizations like Charity Water, which is built on the second curve of philanthropy, being able to have an exponential impact on the issue that they care about. Within a traditional foundation, they're not able to have that impact because they're not built on that second curve of philanthropy. So for all of us within our institutions, it's learning how do we move system by system, process by process onto that second curve of philanthropy. The next step is go. And I think that as a field, we need to learn how to fail faster. And I can always see audiences cringe when I say that, when I talk to nonprofits and foundations. And I know many of you are thinking, we are working in the most marginalized communities. We are working with families and children. We cannot afford to fail them. What I will say is that you are currently failing them just very slowly. So we may not see it at the moment, but what's happening is that as we don't innovate as organizations, problems are getting worse faster than we're able to solve them. And so as institutions, what we have to learn how to do is to try new things, like the things that you've learned in the Look Step. What is the minimum model that you can try within your organization to move change forward? Is it removing 3 questions off of your grant application to make it a little bit more user-friendly? Is it going through one grant round and saying, did we actually get enough information to make a good decision? What's the minimum, absolute minimum model that you need to get something started? And then how can you share what you've learned both within your institution and within the field? The good, the bad, and the ugly. All of us love to share the good. I think the most important things that we can share are what doesn't work. Where are the places that we've hit our head? What's the thing that we tried and it completely was a travesty? How do we tell our other foundations that we've run into those things so that they can refine where you've learned and that we're not all in the same place trying the same things, but instead we're innovating as a field. You have this amazing community of grant makers. And so how do you utilize this network as you try new things to learn from each other so that we don't all have to make the same mistakes? And how do we share those bright spots as they exist within our institutions so that other foundations can implement those bright spots as well? I think the best thing about philanthropy is that there really isn't competition. It sometimes feels that way, but it isn't there. There is more than enough work for all of us to do, and it's only with us working together that big change happens. Very early in my career, I was working for an organization that provided health coverage for people that were uninsured. And as we were working to move that model forward, I met with one of the nuns that ran a similar program. They were providing health assistance to people that didn't have insurance. And so we sat down in my office and we were talking, and the nun said to me, "You guys need to knock this off. We have the uninsured covered. We don't need you sort of stepping around here and doing this work." And I said, "There are like thousands and thousands and thousands of people that are uninsured. I'm pretty sure that the 5 health clinics that you have are not covering all those people." But I think in the field, we've come to the place where we feel like this is my area and this is my thing. As a philanthropic community, what we have to learn is that partnership together is where brilliant change happens and how we move forward in brand new ways. By sharing the credit and by sharing the lessons, wonderful things will happen. So we are entering a time of exponential change. I know that the pace of change feels very, very fast right now, and sometimes I get into the space where I go, I think it just feels fast because I haven't gotten to the bottom of my emails yet. Maybe that's the only issue. What it really is that the world is changing very, very quickly, and humans are not built for this pace of change. This is a robot pace of change. This is an exponential curve that's driven by technology, and we are just at the base of this curve as it starts to turn this way. And that's a really hard time for people because we are made for slow, linear change that's very predictable and very comfortable and very safe. But we're living in a time where that change is going to be a lot faster. So what we need now is masses of visionaries that are willing to build the new, that are willing to work together to develop a vision of what our ideal future looks like. Not what are the terrible things that we think are coming, but what do we want our communities to look like? How do we want to build towards this new possibility? It's a time for all of you to play big, and it's a time for all of your organizations to make a dent in the world. I appreciate all the fantastic work that you are doing in your communities, and I'm going to sit down with Peter, and we're going to have a little bit of a conversation, and then we're going to open it up for questions from the audience. Thank you.